This is the 75th anniversary of the GI Bill, and the VA has asked veterans to do videos showing their VA experience. This is my story. My name is Dennis Wyant. I'm a 100% disabled veteran for blindness, a former Navy officer from the Vietnam era. Before I go on with my story though, I'm standing where history was made. I am in room 570 of the Mayflower Hotel, Washington, D.C. This is where the GI Bill was written 76 years ago. And then the next year, in 1944, President Roosevelt signed it into law. This is the Diamond Jubilee for the GI Bill. When we came into room 570, there was a plaque on the wall that said Harry Comrie stayed in this room, this very room, for 5 months writing the GI Bill. He wrote it on Mayflower stationery. And as I understand it, that rough draft can be seen in the Smithsonian. Harry Comrie was a name that I've heard, and I've always wondered if my father and he knew each other. Both were World War I veterans, both were from Kansas, and both were active with the Kansas American Legions. I do hope their paths crossed at least once. Now my story with the GI Bill is once I was medically retired, I used Chapter 34 of the GI Bill. And this is the chapter that most Vietnam era veterans used to get their education. It was back in the 60s, and I got a master's in business administration and MBA. And since I was a service-connected disabled veteran, I used another chapter of that bill called Chapter 31, Vocational Rehabilitation. And here I got my doctorate, and I focused on the area of vocational rehabilitation when I was doing my studies there. And then in addition, since I was a 100% disabled veteran, my children used Chapter 35, Education for Dependents, to pursue their college dreams. So we have used the GI Bill. But I want to tell you, the GI Bill just wasn't a foundation for me. It was a launching pad. It gave me some opportunities I would have never had. For example, after I got my MBA, I took a job with the Blinded Veterans Association, right across the street from here, not 500 feet. I was their national field director, and when I was working on my dissertation on the job search for blinded veterans, I then completed that, and then I had a chance to be a staff member of a presidential committee. And after that, a manager for a White House conference. And then I was honored when President Carter nominated me for Deputy Assistant Secretary for Veterans Employment. And this required Senate confirmation. At that time, this was the highest job in the federal government that concerned itself with the employment of veterans. And then when I retired, I was in Indianapolis. I was the VA Regional Director. And there I worked with Hoosier vets and their families, 1 million plus. But that's not my entire working career. I left out a decade, and that's the decade that I want to emphasize now. I had the opportunity to direct the GI Bill. Back in the 80s, when I was director, actually I was director of not just education, but that Chapter 35 for education dependence and Chapter 31 for voc rehab, all three under one director. I don't think that has happened since then. I believe they have been separated. But when I was head of Chapter 30 for the GI Bill, that was called the Montgomery GI Bill, named after Sonny Montgomery. He was the chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and everyone loved Sonny. He was a veterans advocate. And the greatest accomplishment I believe that I had during my tenure there is in the VA, we launched the first paperless system in the VA. Did away with all those paper folders for the Chapter 30 GI Bill. We were first in the VA and one of the very first throughout the federal government. And then they divided the two programs, and I was director of vocational rehabilitation, and I loved this job. I think it's the best job in the federal government, the crown jewel of the GI Bill. Because what job would be better than helping disabled vets after they got their medical rehabilitation to help them work back into society and have a meaningful career? And our emphasis then was on exactly that. Now, many times they thought that we should be measuring our program if we could just get a disabled veteran a job. But we balked at that. We thought that if you were a disabled veteran, you had earned the right to get as much training, as much education, commensurate with your abilities, aptitudes, and interests. And that's what we did. And then we helped them find a meaningful career, not a dead-end job. So I love this job. So you can see now why I wanted to tell my story. I was not only a participant in the GI Bill, but I helped manage this wonderful program. And I'm telling you now, standing in this room where the GI Bill was written 75 years ago, 76 years ago, implemented 75 years ago, that I'll sleep well tonight on this bed thinking that I'm glad that I live in a country where its citizens and Congress has these type of programs for their returning servicemen. Thank you and good night.